Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. We're going to be talking about the DevSecOps survey that was recently released. And we've got some panelists here to talk through a couple of the interesting findings within the survey. A little housekeeping before we get started here. Today's presentation is being recorded. We'll make the slides and the recording available to everybody that registered. During today's discussion, everybody is automatically muted, but please go ahead and ask questions. I'll keep an eye on the Q&A and the chat panel so that I can make sure that your questions are coming through. We'll answer your questions throughout the presentation. If time permits, we'll have a Q&A at the end. This is Mark Miller, your host and moderator for the broadcast. I work with Sonatype as the DevOps evangelist and the senior storyteller. In addition to me, we have three panelists today. We've got Derek Weeks, who is a VP and DevOps evangelist at Sonatype. We have Helen Beale calling in. Helen, where are you today? Are you in the UK today?
I am. I'm in London right now.
As you can hear from the accent, she is still in London today. Great. Good to have you with us. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
And then Tyler Shields is Vice President of Signal Sciences, one of the favorite companies that we like to work with personally because James Wickett works with you guys. Tyler, how you doing, Tyler?
Doing well, thanks. Thanks, Mark.
Great, thanks for joining us. This is a very exciting survey for us as we start to look at the results. Derek, can you go to the first slide, please? One of the things that we want to warm up with here is, what is the survey? How did it come about? And what can you expect to see from it when you get your copy? Derek, I'll turn it over to you from there.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Happy to be here today and excited to talk about some of the results that we had from this year's survey. As you can see on the screen, we had almost 2,300 people participate in the survey this year. And I think that that was a super participation rate because it really gave us great visibility into what was happening out in the market related to DevOps practices and specifically to security as it's managed within DevOps practices. I think one of the exciting parts that we were able to see from this survey is that we had run a similar survey or used similar questions to a survey that I led back in 2014 on application security and development. And we had about 3,000 people participating in that survey. And we were able to compare the responses from some of those questions to the questions within this year's survey to get a multi-year comparison. And we're going to go through some of that today throughout the survey. The survey itself ran in February of this year. We started on the 1st of the month and ended on the 28th of the month. And then once the survey had closed, we spent most of the month of March analyzing the survey results, putting together the survey report, some of which the images on the webinar you'll see come directly from the report itself, and to put out the report. Everyone on the webinar today or listening in will be able to get a copy of the report on Sonatype's site. In addition to the report, we do have an infographic that provides a high-level summary of the report. And then we also did something really cool this year, which was I had invited Helen, Tyler Shields, Oleg Grib, Hassan Yassar, and a couple of other people in the industry to look at the survey results in March before we published them, and to pick one of those results and to write an analysis on that result. We put that together in an ebook that's also available on our site, and we've highlighted in our blogs, not only at Sonatype, but across different places like DZone. DZone was also one of the sponsors for the report. But that allowed us to get a lot of visibility and really differing opinions on kind of what the survey data was telling us. And that's part of what I'm excited about on the panel today.
Great, thanks, Derek. Let's go to the first slide here and look, see what we've got as far as return. So what is your role? Helen, I think you found this the most interesting and wanted to highlight this. What interested you about this slide?
So often when I do a presentation and I'm kind of warming up the audience at the start, I often ask people to self-identify whether they're developers or their operations and get a feel for the room and which side people come from. First of all, there's quite a heavy leaning on this particular side towards developers rather than ops, which is kind of interesting. But the standout job title for me is always the DevOps one, and that's the one that I'm really most interested in because that's the one that's new here compared to the other ones. We've only seen people really getting DevOps titles in, say, the past 2 or 3 years, really. And I quite often then get interested about whether that person has chosen that job title themselves or whether they've been assigned it. And it's interesting to hear people's responses. Actually, I did it this morning in a presentation I was in at a little Java conference here in London that's been happening today called JAX. And there were 2 guys in the audience that had DevOps job titles. Most of the audience, interestingly, were in DevOps teams, but that's a whole other conversation we probably don't have time for right now. But this DevOps role is quite interesting. These guys had so they'd requested that role for themselves, but they totally identified with what I said in that often the first people that are given this job title become, actually one of the guys put it really well. He said a MISC job, so like a miscellaneous job. So they often become like the kind of repository for all DBA and release type tasks and the things that people don't really know what to do. Whereas, of course, what we're really trying to do when we give somebody responsibility to DevOps is get them to lead the charge and be the evangelists of this thinking through the organisation. So we're giving them the autonomy or an authority to be a change agent because, as we know, DevOps is not one person's job, it's everyone's job. So we want everybody in the organisation to take on that responsibility. So it was interesting to me for all of those lenses.
Yeah, nice summary there. Tyler, as you're looking at this, are you surprised, or does this kind of line up with what you've been seeing, that 22% would align themselves with DevOps?
Yeah, you know, that 22% number absolutely jumps out at me, right? Yeah, having come from a background as a Forrester analyst, I've done my share of review of surveys such as this, and I think there's certainly some components of self-selection bias here as far as the title goes. But what really is interesting to me is the 22%, and the reason why that 22% is interesting to me is my gut tells me it's drawing off of and taking away from other more traditional titles such as IT ops or things like, you know, some of the other traditional ones like maybe just general IT manager or even, you know, IT application developer, IT AppSec, for a number of reasons, right? One is the sexiness of the new title. And another reason is a point that I think Helen definitely alluded to is that kind of MISC title, that lack of specific, clear definition of responsibility within the DevOps title. Which some people may view as a negative, but many others will view as a, hey, I get a very, very broad purview as a DevOps person. I'm not stuck in one silo. And, you know, what's going to be interesting is to track that growth rate of the self-selected DevOps people from a title perspective over time as we see if it continues to draw away from or distribute out to some of these other title areas.
Thank you, Tyler. Derek, that leads into the next slide. Can we go to the next one and see what we got there? So, Derek, this relates almost back to the previous one. You'd have to have some kind of maturity in your DevOps practice in order to be considered part of DevOps. It's almost a tautology. So, were you surprised when you saw the maturity level that people are self-selecting here?
Yeah, I was definitely surprised, pleasantly surprised, I would say, when we saw the survey responses. You know, part of that might be that, you know, we're running a DevSecOps survey, so we're going to attract a DevOps-related audience, you know, to that to answer questions. So, you know, there might be a bit of selection bias just on calling this out as a DevOps-related survey. But, you know, in all the time that I spend kind of out in the market, out at conferences or DevOps days and conversations, the 26% having very mature DevOps practices, and that includes organizations that said, you know, we have very mature practices in a pocket of our organization that I participate in or across the whole organization. And I believe, if I remember, it was split about 50-50 there. About 13% said the whole organization, another 13% said very mature, you know, in a pocket of the organization. But I kind of get the sense, you know, in DevOps days or different DevOps-related conferences that I'm at, that there are very few of us that would kind of lean, and myself not included, that would lean on saying, hey, we're a DevOps, you know, we're an expert or very mature DevOps practice out there. I think even the best people in the industry, I believe we're still learning how to do this. And just because you've done it with one particular aspect of, you know, testing or continuous delivery, continuous integration within, you know, your development team, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're mature in DevOps in every practice. You know, if you follow someone like Patrick Dubois on Twitter, I mean, this guy is always continuously innovating and trying out new stuff and just, you know, commenting on, here's what I just tried, you know, to try and improve something that he's working on. So the idea that, you know, I have a very mature practice this early on, kind of in the evolution and maturity of DevOps, is a thought pattern, as a process, as a culture, is pretty surprising. And it would be interesting to see, you know, is this kind of like the comments on the last slide? Is this what people think, or is this actually, you know, how they're acting? And I think that kind of belief pattern versus, you know, what you're actually doing, you know, may pull out different results if we had asked these people in person.
Yeah. So let me add a little bit of color there. This is Tyler. Yeah, I definitely think this is a self-view of the world the way that many people wish it was. If we even, first of all, you can't, we haven't really described what maturity in DevOps even is to the world, as you mentioned, because DevOps is such a rapidly changing verb, not even a noun, but a verb, and the ability to call it mature, I think, is premature. But what's really interesting to me here is if you look at security alone, as if you say security is a requirement for a mature DevOps practice, these numbers are going to fall through the floor immediately. I mean, you can push to production 30 times a day. All you're doing is increasing the velocity at which you push bugs and vulns into your production systems without morphing and changing how you do security around DevOps to match. And so I think the fundamental piece here is, sure, you may be mature in either A, your own eyes, or B, in one specific subsection of the verb that is DevOps. But I think a lot of people are deluding themselves, and that's what this data says to me.
You know, Tyler, I think we agree with you. Helen and I were talking yesterday about, is there an established maturity model for this industry? Helen, you said that you had a couple things that you're working with.
Yeah, we've been doing maturity assessments for quite a few years now around DevOps, and we have a number of tools. I think, as Tyler explained, though, DevOps is quite challenging because it is moving really fast. So the presentation I did this morning was around the emerging DevOps super pattern and a number of different strands and disciplines that are coming together. Things like safety culture and learning organizations and all these different things that are making DevOps quite a different thing from what it was sort of 4 or 5 years ago. So there's that challenge. We have a number of different tools and maturity matrices that we use, but I think the DevOps space, this is what I was trying to explain this morning as well, it kind of resists being pinned down. So I had a pair of scales on my charts this morning, and on one side I had a cage, and on the other side I had a bird flying free. And it's kind of like we're trying to get this balance with DevOps in that pinning it down enough that we can articulate what it is and what we want to do and why we should be doing it, whilst allowing it to evolve naturally in its own way. But I would agree with the assertion that people are probably rating themselves more mature than they are. So a common DevOps fail, if you like, that we see is that people will think DevOps is continuous delivery, and they'll build a bit of a continuous delivery pipeline, and they'll think they've done quite a lot of DevOps. What often happens next, they try and get the organization to consume that pipeline or that tool chain, and they run into problems, and that's normally because they haven't addressed the cultural pieces correctly, which are really difficult. So there are lots of things about DevOps and doing DevOps and being DevOps that people miss. So yeah, I was surprised by these numbers, and I think there's probably people are rating themselves a bit more highly than they perhaps are.
Thank you. Tyler, I want to move on to the next observation that we have. Derek, if you can move the slide forward. One of the things that we're still dealing with is developer versus security. This number doesn't seem to have moved in years. Is there any hope?
Yeah, it's funny you put it that way, because the application security concepts or space or market, whatever you want to call it, has been around, almost probably 15 or more years, at least in the vendor capacity, and we really haven't made much headway. It's interesting. Gartner reports that worldwide spend on security budget, overall security budget, was something like $82 billion in 2016. But they also note that 2.7% of that budget was spent on application security. According to the Verizon Data Breach Report, the highest number, 40% of successful data breaches, come through web applications. So we're spending a minuscule amount of money on what's arguably the biggest problem in security. When we exacerbate that to the talent shortage, things get so out of whack. So if we look at the 100-to-1 number and say, hey, 100-to-1 has been failing us forever, for the last 15 years, and we're not putting our resources in the right place, I would definitely argue that, yes, we have a very slim chance of being successful at the application security space as we're doing it today. The 100-to-1 number will never work. It'll never solve the problem. And I think if you even decrease that to 50-to-1, it's still not going to work. What really has to happen is similar to what happened when DevOps came and took over application development, and that's changing the tools and processes and the expectations of success versus just changing the number of bodies that you ship at the problem. And so, this 100-to-1 has been touted forever. It's somewhat accurate, whatever. I think it's actually an irrelevant stat. Instead, we have to completely upend and flip how we do application security across the board and innovate it in new and exciting ways that are really similar to the way DevOps innovated and has changed, fundamentally changed how we do development as a whole. And when we can do that, you'll see the cultural shifts that will occur, similar to the ones that are happening in DevOps, will begin to happen in the application security space as well.
I like your observation, Tyler, that the 100-to-1 is really an irrelevant number. It really doesn't mean anything more. As we start talking about automated security and security becoming part of the process. Derek, we saw a lot of that at all the DevOps, right? When we actually did the automated security channel, there's a lot of increased interest in automated security now.
Yeah, I think the thing that I see, Mark, when I get this number, or when I see this number is, a lot of us focus on kind of there are 100 developers for every application security professional in the organization, and yes, you will never find parity there where the ratio is more equal. But I think it's not just an element of you're outnumbered by people or outnumbered by talent within the organization. When we're practicing DevOps the way the best in the industry are doing it, you're outnumbered by the number of commits. You're outnumbered by the number of deploys. You're outnumbered by the number of artifacts or components that are being created in these environments. If you're doing 1,000 commits a day, you can't keep up with that. And we also know that you're outnumbered by the population of people that are trying to attack your organization from the outside. If you're working at financial institutions or certainly well-known tech companies, you're under continuous attack in being outnumbered there. And I think when we look at the DevOps practices and the evolution of DevOps and adoption of DevOps practices, it really changes from this model of kind of, what kind of approaches to security can I take, and what kind of tools do I have available? As Tyler was saying, on the spend on security technologies, it really shifts from what are my investments there to the thought process around what is my role, and how does my role really, take on a new flavor. And part of that is I can be a defender within my organization and trying to protect a specific part of the operations or a specific application. But in the world of trying to keep up with the numbers and not being outnumbered, you have to get toward automation. And that's really where the role changes in DevOps to say, it's not necessarily my role to protect the organization, but to find ways to automate things that can protect the organization, that can help me keep pace. So instead of, let me look at this new open source vulnerability or check all of the open source components in an application for vulnerabilities, it's how do I instrument a system that will do that for me? So my role is defining the rules and having the systems do the work. And I think that's an evolution that we see in a number of places across DevOps practices, whether that's in development or integration or testing or release orchestration.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Derek, while I've got you here, go to the next slide because we can relate here. It goes right to the heart of what we're talking about here. And I'd like to open this discussion up to all three of you at once. So Derek, I'll let you go first. And then Tyler and Helen jump in as you want to respond. But where is security being automated? This slide is probably the heart of the study here, because all three of you, when you first saw this, said this is something important to talk about.
Yeah, I think I'll help just by framing the chart, because there's a lot of bars and numbers here. But the important thing is this is one of the questions that we asked in 2014 where are you implementing security across the development lifecycle, and where are you automating those practices across the lifecycle? And the blue bars show you what the responses were in 2014. And then in 2017, the yellow bars represent the overall survey responses. But what we did in the survey results in this particular question, as well as a couple of others, is we looked at how did the most mature DevOps practices, those that said they had very mature practices in pockets or across the whole organization, how did those people respond? And you can see that for those organizations that had the belief or understanding that they were a mature DevOps practice, there were considerable jumps in where security is being applied, where it's being automated. And the big difference between 2014 and 2017 between the blue and the purple is those numbers nearly triple over a 3-year period. And of course it's not an apples to apples comparison, but the conversation of DevSecOps wasn't really happening in 2014, or it was just burgeoning at that point. So to see that jump in where security is being applied everywhere across the life cycle, but also more and more early across the life cycle, I think was an impressive point that came out in the survey data.
So to add a little bit of more color onto that, in essence, this maps to an SDLC, okay? Design, development, QA, prior to production, and then kind of a summary, a catch-all. And the reality of it is, in the AppSec world, the SDLC has been completely reinvented by DevOps, right? The SDLC, as we once understood it, does not exist anymore. And what you're seeing here is a mapping of uptake and interest in both tools, people, processes on how we morph this SDLC to match the new realities of application development. What this says to me is that people recognize the problem is there, you know, going from, say, if we look at prior to release and production, going from 24 to 45, even 57 for the most mature. So they recognize the problem. They are beginning to make progress on applying security to that problem, to what we have now as our new reality. You know, it's also very exciting to me in the sense that, you know, at the end of the day, this is an opportunity for innovation. This is an opportunity for doing things different than we've ever done before. This is an opportunity to eventually get security, application security specifically, ubiquitous into the minds of the developers, the operators, and the security team, right? And I think we're seeing people adopt that. And I mean, if you look at businesses like my own, Signal Sciences, and I'm sure Sonatype and others, you know, we're seeing rapid adoption from the DevOps world, and that's because there is a dearth of solutions and tools that help them achieve these goals. So there's a very clear demand here for shift. There's very clear demand here for positive change in the AppSec world. And I've written on this before that I think we're at a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity as application security practitioners or security people in general, that we have to embrace the desire and the need of the development and operations worlds right now. They're open. They are open to discussion. They are open to changing processes. They are open to improving and innovating how they do things in their world, thanks to DevOps. We as practitioners and vendors need to make sure that we're there to fill those gaps and make this world a safer and more secure place when that opportunity strikes itself and is available. And that's what I read into this data.
I mean, I love looking at this, and I love kind of what you were just saying about this being the reality. And I like to think about the kind of reality, but also the utopia. So being kind of quite aspirational about where things are going. So could we just pop back to the graph for a second? So what I was doing in my head was trying to imagine kind of what our utopic response kind of pattern would look like. And if you take the blue bars and forget the one on the far right hand side, because that's being tested everywhere, you've got a bit of a kind of upward slope. And as we move into this year's version, so both for the all responses and the mature responses, you've got more of a curve in the middle. And for my kind of utopic response to this graph, what I'd want is more people doing stuff earlier. So you'd want that leaning down. So you can see from 2014 to 2017, there's been a shift towards the middle. And if that shift keeps on going, as Tyler's been explaining, we're really doing this kind of shifting left, kind of breaking the SDLC up, breaking that waterfall process and making everything much more continuous. So the requirement or the need to, for example, do security so much in production, apart from obviously incorporating it into our infrastructure as code, whatever it is, that requirement starts to fall away because we know that what we're putting into production is going to be good.
You know, Helen, that's an interesting observation that I hadn't seen before. Derek, too, when you look at the blue bars, you can see that it leads from down to the left up to the right as far as the pattern goes. But when you look about a third of the way, the yellow bars start to slope down, meaning that we have made significant progress, it looks like, as far as moving left in the cycle. So this is a fascinating chart. Derek, can we move on to the next set here? That was just working on the previous slide, I think, right?
Yeah.
There we go. So, Derek, what we're starting here is 1 in 5 had or suspected in the last 12 months. How does that relate in general historically to what you've been seeing with the previous studies?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because we asked this question, you know, have you had a breach related to a web application vulnerability? And we also asked the same question about have you had or suspected a breach related to an open source vulnerability, an open source component vulnerability in the last 12 months. And both came in with about 20%, or 1 in 5 people taking the survey suspecting that they had a breach, or confirming that they had a breach, as part of the survey responses. So the interesting thing here, and I've done a lot of press interviews on the survey recently, and everyone's asking me kind of what was one of the bigger surprises. And the one we spent the most time on was that previous chart we were just talking about. But this one also came to mind because when we ran the survey before and we had asked this question in 2014, we happened to run that survey in April of 2014, from the 1st until the 30th of the month. In that month, on April 7th, if you remember, that is the day that the Heartbleed vulnerability was announced. And by April 10th of that month, everyone worldwide, certainly in the security community, knew about it. Any of the IT organizations were out looking for, did they have vulnerable versions of the OpenSSL component being used within their organizations, and it even hit the national news channels, so that mom and dad were hearing about these security vulnerabilities within web applications. I thought because we ran, it was just happenstance that we ran the survey that month. I thought that the number of people that had or suspected breaches would be much higher in those survey responses than what we saw this year. When we ran it in February of this year, there wasn't a major breach or vulnerability announcement that came out during that month that may have boosted the number. So I thought, maybe just because of the timing of the 2014 survey, where we had 14% had or suspected breaches in the prior 12 months, I thought that the Heartbleed news that happened during that survey would have boosted those numbers. But what we saw is we went from 14% 3 years ago to 20% in this survey, and that was pretty surprising that either there's just more visibility to vulnerabilities that are out there and people that are being impacted. I don't know that there's any more breaches. Maybe it's just that the awareness has gone up within the survey community because of Heartbleed and Bash and Poodle and all the other vulnerabilities that got logos over the past years. But I'd be interested to hear what Tyler and Helen thought when they saw these.
Yeah, it's this one's interesting. So as an interesting data point here is that Signal Sciences provides web protection to web applications. It's what we do. And one of our key value props that we provide is visibility into application attacks at runtime that are happening on your production systems. What's interesting is 85% of our customers are what we call greenfield customers and don't have a solution in place. 85% of our customers have zero visibility into the web attacks that are happening in their production systems in real time. That's a scary stat. So what really I think this is 20% suspect that they probably had some issues, but they have no clue. I think the reality on the ground here is that most enterprises really have no true insight into the applications that are happening in their production environment. And this is just a shot in the dark. This is just a yeah, maybe kind of swag estimate that the populace is able to give here, because they really don't have enough insight and visibility into what's happening in those systems in real time. And I think that's even scarier an issue than a 20% vulnerability rate in the last 12 months.
Do you think the real number is higher? I mean, so if this is just a swag by people guessing?
Yeah, I think the reality is way, way higher as far as actual web application attacks and vulnerabilities in the last 12 months.
Helen, you were about to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I totally support that from our observations in the field as well. I think, it is scary, and I hesitate to use the word ignorance, but I feel that a lot of attention is spent on infrastructure security rather than application security. A lot of people think that they've got it covered because they do some kind of vulnerability testing on a fairly regular basis, but they kind of miss a lot of things that are built into their applications. And I think one of the big problems I've always seen with people acquiring additional application security capability is it often takes not just a suspected vulnerability, but a major incident for them to sit up and take notice. And by that point, it's far, far too late. You know, they've lost the customer data. They're now going to be fined, or whatever the consequences are of that. So yes, I think there are the customers we work with, or most of the organisations here, certainly have got quite a lot of work to do to prioritise this. And just to speak from their side for a moment, part of the challenge that they've got is there is so much for them to do. So there's cloud and there's Docker and there's this and there's that, and this kind of level of intelligence and security sometimes just isn't at the top of the pile of the to-do list.
Yeah, it's one of the harder subfields, if you want to call them that, in security in general, right? Is application security. It's a difficult field, and so if you think we've got a problem in actually having enough headcount for general security people, try looking for application experts.
There we go. Helen, I think I want to go to you on this one. It's talking about the cultural aspects of how security and security people are perceived. I think most of the audience has probably heard of or read the Phoenix Project and know about John, the security guy. And it's kind of funny that in the majority, he's still perceived that way. Can you talk to that?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, I have a special interest in the cultural side of DevOps, or human ops, or hug ops, whatever you want to call it. And yes, I think John is the archetypal InfoSec person, but I meet so many customers who tell me that they're living in that book right now. So archetypal, stereotypical, you know, that those people do live out there. And I think the thing about John is he's very, very difficult, and he causes a lot of problems, and he is far too detailed, and he thinks his stuff is so much more important. He doesn't really get the just good enough stuff. But actually, it's John that goes and has the epiphany, and it's John that comes back, and it's John that does that very DevOps thing and breaks down the barriers and starts collaborating effectively. It's John that understands that for the organisation to be successful, they need to put the customer's value issues and the business issues up front and centre, and it's him that makes it happen and makes that collaboration happen around the organisation. So I think the core to, or the key to all of this from a cultural perspective is to incorporate security in all of our daily lives. So I'm always kind of reversing back to that ratio slide 100 to 1 earlier, and again kind of reflecting on what Tyler was saying, in that you know, security isn't in the DevOps world just InfoSec's job, it's everyone's job, and automation can help us spread that expertise, so it can help us build pre-blessed security libraries and things like that, so our developers can use it, but they need to have a modicum of thought about those non-functional requirements around security as they develop code. There has to be more cross-functional capability, and I'm not saying that everybody in the organisation needs to be a security expert, because clearly that's impossible. But it's about spreading and that knowledge as much as possible, and automation can really help us to do that.
I think that pretty much nailed it. Thanks. Tyler, Derek, any comment on that?
Yeah, you know, I think this is reminiscent of, you know, security coming in, you know, late in the life cycle for a lot of people. When security is identifying problems late in the life cycle and throwing them back toward development, they're going to be seen as a nag. I think in organizations that we've talked to, you know, whether that's you know, JPMC or Aetna or Intuit, you know, where they're building security in at the earliest points of, you know, design, at the earliest points of development, you know, that security is just seen as a peer on the team, right? And it's, you know, I'm the DevOps person that specializes in security, or the, you know, DevOps person specializing in development practices, but, you know, we're sitting side by side. We're working with one another and understanding how we're building apps secure from the start. And I think in those organizations, you would see that there's probably less of the nag role because you're sitting side by side with those colleagues. The applications aren't being thrown over the wall to be tested, somewhere weeks or months after they were developed. So I think that's maybe just reflective of the maturity of practices out there.
Tyler, that leads us to the next talking point too. Derek, can you go to the next slide, please?
So one more thing on that last slide,
Sure.
Mark. Security wins when security ceases to exist. Okay, and let me explain what I mean by that. Secure development. We take that phrase. We take the phrase secure operations. We take the phrase security testing. Security wins when it ceases to exist. When you can take all of those words, lop off the word secure, and just call it development, and it's done securely, that's when security wins. And the only time that that's ever going to happen is to have security truly integrated into the process and the people that are doing all of the real meat of the work of development, of operations, of creation. And that's when we'll win.
I like that. I think everybody would like that. That leads us then, Tyler, to protection for running applications. You touched on it earlier. I mean, this is your field of expertise. This is right in your wheelhouse here. Look at this and tell us what you thought when you first saw this thing here.
Yeah, I mean, what I thought when I first saw it is, how do I market to this slide? The reality of it is, though, is that the concept of a web application firewall in its traditional capacity is antiquated and pretty much a dead idea. So I predict that over the next 3 to 5 years, we'll see a huge shift. That 58% should go through the floor, and kind of innovative approaches such as the next-gen WAF or the runtime application self-protection technologies. These are going to continue to rise. And why is that, right? What are WAFs doing wrong that these other new innovative companies are doing right? The new innovative companies are embedding into the heart of the application. They're getting close to the context of the application. They're getting close to the meat of the application, and they're designed and built for a DevOps cloud-first world from the ground up. And that's going to be the fundamental innovation that's going to really disrupt this market. Now, I wanted this slide in here for one particular reason. Not necessarily to talk about, the area of focus where my company resides, but to say this is an innovation that's occurring to match DevOps that should be successful long-term in embedding security into how we run, operate, and develop our applications, right? But if we go back to that SDLC slide, conceptually, this is one column. My company is innovating one column here, and that's the column about operational protection of the production systems, the second column from the right. Potentially even the one before that, you could say we're innovating as well. Innovation across the board needs to occur at every single column here for security and DevOps to work properly. And so I like that last slide to talk about how we're doing things better in this one area, but what I implore entrepreneurs, other vendors, and certainly buyers to demand is innovation across all of those SDLC sectors that get your security technologies to operate in a DevOps-centric, cloud-centric universe, which is where the future is, which is where today is. So we need to let go of the past, glom onto the future direction for development as a whole, and make sure that our technologies, innovations, and people and processes are able to embed themselves in a secure manner into that. And then when we achieve that, we achieve security disappearing as a concept and becoming embedded into our actual systems and lifestyles that we've built.
That
also, go ahead, Derek, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just comment that I've had this conversation, I'm sure Helen has as well, with clients that, when you look at specific tools, whether these or any other tools that you would consider, the tools that you might use in more of a waterfall native environment or development processes versus a DevOps native environment sometimes have to change. You can't take tools that have maybe automated some part of security testing later in the life cycle and just say, I'm going to go and embed that same static analysis tool inside my developer's IDE. That might not be purpose-built for that, for that particular task. So, in some cases, when you're trying to shift left in the development lifecycle, you have to consider new tools that come into play, because the waterfall native ones can't move, and that's not just true for security tools related to DevOps, but for any tools. And it's a matter of, I've heard this time and again about, automating a bad process just means you're doing more bad stuff quickly. And that's not what DevOps is trying to accomplish. It's not just about doing more stuff through an automated way, but it's figuring out what work really needs to be done and where does it need to be done most effectively, for us to get the efficiencies and the productivity, out of the DevOps practices that we're pursuing.
Great, thank you. Derek, let's skip the next slide, the one on Docker, and go directly to the final closing slide, because what I'd like to do is give everybody a chance, starting with Helen, to kind of summarize the report and how they see it might be utilized as we're trying to move the DevOps community forward. So, Helen, give us your 30-second overview of the report.
So I think the way you've introduced what I kind of need to say, and I think what we've just been hearing very much in the last few statements, is that this is an education job for a lot of us. What we're trying to do is help lots and lots of people understand new principles and new approaches to doing things. So the DevOps way, if you like, if we want to use that portmanteau to describe all of this. And I think it's hard for people that have done things the same way for a very long time, so who are very used to being waterfally, have tools that they like that seem to work for them, to understand there's a better way. But I think things like this report, particularly that bar chart that we all love, that really shows how people are understanding about shifting left and doing security automation earlier on in their SDLC or their continuous release lifecycle, is really important. So thank you very much for Sonatype for doing this work. We'll be taking the opportunity to share it widely in our own work.
Great, thank you, Helen. Tyler, when you're looking at this, I like the excitement in your voice when you're seeing some of this. Give us your summary of what the report's going to mean for people when they read it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple quick touch bullets, quick hit bullets. One, DevOps is here. Don't let anybody tell you DevOps is coming. DevOps was here a while ago. It's here to stay, and it's completely fundamentally changing how we do business. Not only development, but how we do business. So step one, if you want to be a dinosaur, that's fine, but you're going to be out of a job eventually because you're going to have to reinvent yourself given this new world order, this new paradigm. So throw away what you know, throw away what you think you know, and be opening and accepting of challenging the AppSec norm or the security as a whole norm, because fundamentally, if we keep too much of that baggage, we'll never be able to shift to a world that actually has a positive impact. And I think what's neat about this this survey work is that I have huge glimmers of hope in there that this is going to happen, right? People see it. People see the fundamental changes needed for DevOps to be successful and what the positives it brings are, and security can totally ride on the piggyback of that and ride that wave forward. And I think that's what we're seeing. And so I implore, and one of the things I take away from this is I implore people to kind of throw away the traditional, be accepting of new and trying things differently. It's scary to say, you know what, I'm pushing to production 20, 30 times a day. And you know what, there's going to be flaws out there, but I've completely retooled my incident response, my visibility, my security visibility, and I've broken down the silos between all my groups by democratizing my security data. Guess what? I can handle any vulns that'll come from 30 pushes a day. Be accepting of that, take the risks, and make the shifts. We can be successful.
Thank you, Tyler, so much for your participation. Derek, Tyler says there's a glimmer of hope. Well, where does that leave you?
When I think about this survey, I go back to one of my favorite sayings, and that is, keeping score improves the score. And for me, surveys like this really represent an image of what is the score out there. And when anyone out there that's listening or viewing the survey results takes a chance to look at those, my hope is that you'll take those back into your organization, into your next staff meeting, or to your next lunch out with colleagues, and share those results with them, and have some honest conversations about where do you think we fit as an organization? How good are we? Do we stack up to the norm? Are we better than average? Are there areas that we need to improve? And that's really, you know, what these pieces of research offer to me is it's an opportunity to start the conversation out there and to begin to compare how we're performing against others. So keeping score improves the score, and this just helps.
Oh, great. Thank you, guys. I can tell that the session was appreciated because we had virtually no drop-off during the session as far as attendees go. So the subject, as I like the way Tyler put it, we're past the glimmer of hope now. This is actually happening. So it's very exciting to have a conversation like this. Thank you all three. Everybody that is attending or did register for the event will get a copy of the survey results. You'll have access to the recording, and we hope that you'll continue the DevOps discussions wherever you are. This is Mark Miller, the DevOps evangelist and senior storyteller for Sonatype. Thank you so much for attending, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a great afternoon.